Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, she said she would, and apparently Theresa May has raised concerns about human rights in Saudi Arabia during talks with the country's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's been on a 3-day UK visit to talk about trade and presumably some of the more awkward issues like Yemen. The visit comes the same week as International Women's Day, and women's rights is another area Saudi Arabia isn't exactly celebrated for. Here's Ellie.
At nearly every stop on the Saudi Arabian visit this week, the protesters haven't been far. Well, today I got the opportunity to talk to one of 29 women who sit on the Shura Council. It's not exactly a parliament, but it's the council that advises the Saudi Arabian king. And there's plenty to put to her. A good place to start? Women's rights. A country that in June is finally allowing women to drive cars, and that is being seen as progress. It's a woeful record, isn't it?
The country is young, not just in its population, but as in its age. Effectively, it's an 80-year-old country, but I actually always say it's a 50-year-old country, because when the first revenue of oil came to the country, to the government, that's when it was used for the infrastructure. When you look at a country that is basically 50 years old, we're only going one way, which is forwards. But it cannot happen from one day to the next.
But it is true that women don't have the same rights as men, don't have the same rights that they would here in the UK.
When did you get your rights?
Well, more than 100 years ago, women have been voting, for example.
That's fine, but how long did it take for you to have that? I mean, I'm talking about a country of 50 years old. You were not 50 years old when you got your rights. I'm not justifying the fact that in your eyes we are slow. Yes, it is challenging. There are obstacles. We get frustrated. I'm not denying any of that. It is a reality. It is there.
But what about you personally? You're a woman living in Saudi Arabia.
When I need to find myself at XYZ place at a certain time, and I can't be there because of transportation reasons, yes, of course I get it. Today things are easier. With Uber, with Karim, and with private drivers, obviously things do get easier. But when I look at it on a global level, a 50-year-old country to have reached what a lot of countries took hundreds of years to do. And like I said, I think that the only way we have to go is forwards.
Much has been made this visit of Vision 2030, a blueprint by King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of economic and social reforms to modernise Saudi Arabia. You yourself have a daughter. Do you think Saudi Arabia of the future will be an easier place to thrive for a woman?
I believe it will be, but if it's not done in 2030 and it's done in 2032, that's fine too. Like I said, it's part of the evolutionary development of the country. It's not stagnating. And because we are moving forward, it can only it'll get better from next year, it'll get better the year after. Because we are seeing these changes, because there is a genuine desire to change and reform, and it's not just because Prince Mohammed or King Salman want that to happen, it's because the young people of the country want it to happen. And these young people are coming back from their education abroad, not just with a degree, but with an opening of horizons mental horizons that will change the way they live, will change their aspirations.
There have been protests during your visit here about human rights abuses, about the situation in Yemen. Do you find some of those difficult to defend?
Politically speaking, when a country is surrounded by enemies more than by friends, there are certain actions that need to be taken, especially if politically and diplomatically chances were given, not just once, not just twice, more than that. We have had the example of Hezbollah in the north. We don't want a resurgence or a reappearance of something like that in the south. I'm not justifying the deaths or the human rights issues that come with any war. I'm just stating a fact. And I think that it is very easy to criticize and to talk about issues when they're not relatively clear to the general public.
So the idea that the situation in Yemen is a proxy war against Iran is what?
There's part of that. I'm not denying that at all. Iran has a big role, has had a big role in this issue, yes.
Ellie Price talking there to Hoda Al-Halassi. Rachel Shabi, do you share her optimism in terms of the pace of reform that Saudi Arabia is very keen to promote? And we saw that underlined there in that interview, certainly in terms of women's rights.
No. I mean, there have been cosmetic reforms, and obviously we need to credit and celebrate the Saudi women who campaigned for those reforms 2 decades in the case of getting the right to drive. But they are cosmetic reforms as long as the underpinning system of male guardianship exists in Saudi Arabia, whereby women have to get permission from a male guardian to do all kinds of things that essentially amount to them having their equal rights and freedoms as citizens. So as long as there is that system underpinning everything in Saudi Arabia, then these kind of reforms will be cosmetic.
Right. In terms of then the relationship that Britain has with Saudi Arabia, how under pressure is that now, with accusations of British military advisors being involved in the war in Yemen?
Well, I don't think it is necessarily under pressure. I mean, the UK government has invested a lot of faith and a lot of time in recent months building up to this week to really make a fuss of MBS, and there's a calculation, a play made by the Foreign Office and by Number 10 that what he's doing is potentially transformative.
Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, yeah.
And, I mean, while I share some of the scepticism, and there are reasons to be cautious about it, I think what he's doing is potentially transformative. And the French, for example, have been far ahead of the UK in terms of trade and being in there with the new leadership. And Britain had some catching up to do, that's what this week was about.
Right, I mean, those trade deals are extremely important, worth potentially billions of pounds.
Look, the trouble with this very cosy relationship with Saudi Arabia is not just his human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia itself, and the treatment of women comes up in that category. But it is that it is a destabilising force in the Middle East. You know, it backed the military coup against the democratically elected president in Egypt. It has at least covertly funded some pretty violent extremists in Syria and Iraq. It effectively kidnapped a Lebanese prime minister just a few months ago, and that's before we get onto the horrific human rights violations that are going on in Yemen, aided and abetted by the UK, whose arms sales to Yemen have increased by an extraordinary amount in the last couple of years, despite all these very clear human rights violations. And what that does to Britain is that it undermines our reputation and our credibility in the Middle East and internationally.
Is it defensible?
No, Yemen is a catastrophe. Of course it's a catastrophe, but you can't possibly look at Yemen without looking at the role of Iran. I mean, you cannot have a situation from the Saudis' position in which Iran... Of course we are. We've taken that decision to be closely allied with the Saudis for 40, 50 years. But you cannot have a situation from a geopolitical point of view where essentially Iranian interests win out in Yemen against the Saudis. He's also, in terms of funding terrorism, it seems, we'll see if he's as good as his word, but what he seems to have said to the National Security Council and MI5 and MI6 is that there won't be, or that he will curtail the funding and promotion of Wahhabism. We'll see. But right. I mean, he's only been in power for a relatively short amount of time. It seems to be heading in broadly, I would have thought, the right direction.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I know lots to talk about in terms of what can be seen as a proxy war there in Yemen.
Britain is close to agreeing a multi-billion-pound deal to supply Saudi Arabia with 48 Typhoon fighter jets. It coincides with the last day of a visit by the new Saudi leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. It's a welcome shot in the arm for UK industry, but has already attracted criticism. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner is with me. And Frank, with Saudi Arabia waging war in Yemen, this was always going to be controversial, wasn't it?
It certainly was. And I have to say, I think it's a punch in the nose for the hundreds of protesters who came out to demonstrate outside Downing Street against both the visit and the arms trade between Britain and Saudi Arabia, plus all those who are sitting at home probably shaking their heads at this. But for the government and for the defence industry and for those who think that Saudi Arabia is the right ally to have, then it's certainly, as you say, a shot in the arm. Over 5,000 jobs in the UK depend on this, many more in Saudi Arabia. This is a man, the Crown Prince, who is shaking up that country. He's seen as a bulwark against Iranian expansionism, against its missile program, against its whole aggressive stance as it's perceived in parts of the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia cooperates on counter-terrorism. They passed a tip-off that stopped an attack in 2012, just ahead of the London Olympics. So the government has taken the view that, despite its concerns, which were raised last night at Chequers by the Prime Minister over dinner, they're going to go ahead with these defence sales. That's not going to be popular with some people because of Yemen.
Frank, thank you.
Now, good news if you work in a certain aircraft factory in Lancashire. Not so good, maybe, if you live in Yemen. As Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman rounded off a trip to the UK tonight, his country signed a letter of intent to buy 48 more Typhoon fighters from BAE Systems. Britain is under fire from human rights groups for arming Saudi Arabia at the same time as Mr. bin Salman, Prince bin Salman, one of the architects of the Yemen war, is portrayed by his country's media as the kingdom's best hope for human rights, reform and renewal. Today's announcements about the planes followed meetings with Theresa May, Boris Johnson and the Queen. Earlier, I spoke to Sherrod Cooper-Coles, formerly ambassador to Saudi Arabia and indeed a former consultant to BAE Systems. I asked him if this deal was good news for people in factories across the UK.
Yes, good news for the British economy, but also good news for British influence in the Middle East, good news for our relationship with Saudi Arabia, good news for a Britain leaving the European Union still to be a player in this sort of area. And the question you have to ask is, if we hadn't gone ahead with this order, what would have happened to our relationship, but also where else would they have gone?
But if the UK hadn't gone ahead, would it, in a sense, have cleaner hands? Because Saudi Arabia is now involved in this war in Yemen. It's a humanitarian disaster. They're bombing civilians with British-made weapons. Surely becoming a bit more toxic for this country in that sense.
Well, it is for everyone, and the key is, do we want to retain influence? Do we want to help bring about a peaceful settlement? Do we want to
but selling more weapons?
Well, the alternative is not selling weapons. This is about the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And we could break off our relationship with Saudi Arabia. We could have not have had this week's visit, but we've had no influence. No, we wouldn't have been a player in the Middle East.
When you were ambassador in Riyadh, that's a decade plus ago.
Yeah.
Was it more like the world that, as one might have wanted it? Was it an easier, less controversial relationship?
I think when I was ambassador there, I was trying to encourage change. I remember briefing British ministers to raise the need to move forward on women's rights, to move forward on social rights, to move forward on education. And now we have a leader at last in Saudi Arabia who's doing what every friend of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, is doing what we've all urged him to do.
Do you think he's for real?
He's definitely for real, highly intelligent, very enthusiastic, very curious, very decisive, very young, someone who needs friends, who needs supporters, who needs people around him to help him deliver this vision. But there is someone immensely popular in his country.
But there is another interpretation, isn't there? Some Western-friendly steps, like allowing women to drive, allowing cinemas, but a rate of public executions that's higher than ever, and indeed an anti-corruption drive, which when you talk to some Saudis, just seems to be like a shakedown operation to bring in a lot of money from rival princes.
Well, you know, as I say, you take the world as it is, not as you'd like it to be. It's an imperfect world. But here is somebody who's delivering reform that isn't a question of it being Western-friendly reform. It's people-friendly reform. It's what the young people of Saudi Arabia want. And we need to use our influence with him, administering tough love in private, to get the kinds of results we want.
And tough love, does that mean saying to him in private, get out of Yemen, solve this Yemen problem quickly, because it's extremely damaging to the image of Saudi Arabia and to the UK providing you with weapons?
Well, it's not a question of the image of Saudi Arabia. It's a question of the right solution for Yemen, for the Arabian Peninsula, for the region as a whole. You need to remember, Mark, that Saudi Arabia is actually threatened from Yemen. Rockets have been fired from Yemen towards Riyadh.
It is. I mean, they are firing missiles at
but
Riyadh,
those
but that was after Saudi began its intervention.
Those attacks were coming across the border before Saudi intervened, and this is part of a perfectly legitimate operation.
A lot of people will tell you that the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Sultan, is the architect of this disastrous intervention in Yemen. Is he therefore the man to get Saudi Arabia out of it?
He's absolutely someone we need to work with. I'm quite sure Yemen was very high on the agenda, and it wasn't us lecturing the Saudis just to get out of Yemen and leave behind chaos, but work with everyone involved to produce a solution that delivers stability, that delivers security, and above all delivers some relief for the poor, suffering people of Yemen on all sides.
Sherrod Cooper-Coles, thank you so much.
I've been